and I'm a human rights specialist. And one of the things that I look after is the TV Industry Human Rights Forum. Now, this was set up by 4 broadcasters, initially back in 2017, so BBC, ITV, Sky, and NBC Universal, to understand the human rights risks in how TV is made. So it's not the stuff that we actually see on the screen, but it's all the things about how it is made. And they brought me on board in 2019 to help them think this through, to look at the gaps that aren't currently addressed and find different ways forward. So what I do is I conduct research. I talk to a lot of impacted stakeholder groups. We try and learn from good practice around the industry and try and bring in insights from other industries as well. And then the idea is that that gets shared as widely as possible, because everyone wants to improve. And we had Channel 4 joining as a member as well. So there are now 5 broadcasters. And on the back of the research that I do, I develop resources, tools and guidance to try and help the broadcasters actually implement recommendations and put things into practice. Given we're quite small, is it worth just going round so I know who everyone is? Start with just a quick introduction about who you are. Fiona?
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm Fiona. I'm I'm interested in sustainability. That's my main reason of being here. And obviously this is kind of part of the social aspect of sustainability. So I'm not a media producer. My area is relationship marketing, but obviously I'm interested in the media. So that's why I'm here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hello. Yeah, so I'm an associate professor here in children's media. So my background is in producing children's media, and now I'm very closely connected with the Children's Media Foundation, and yeah, that'll do for now.
Brilliant, thanks. Gifty?
Hi, so I'm with the media. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I'm with the media production team at Bournemouth University, Media and Communication faculty. I'm specifically interested in digital media, using it to create awareness about human rights things, especially human trafficking. So that's why I'm here.
Fantastic, nice to meet you. Emily? Oh, Emily, we can't hear you. Okay, you'll put it in the chat. Fantastic. Ravinder?
Hi everybody. I am a film researcher based in, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I'm a film researcher based in India. I am actually, I was actually quite surprised to, come across even, the connection of human rights with, film or television work. So that's why I was quite curious, I wanted to know what you guys were doing, and it's so surprising to see that even, I mean, this kind of initiative is coming from the producers side also, which is something that we do not actually find here in India. So that's why I'm quite curious to know and learn from you. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Adrian?
My microphone's already on. Awesome. Sorry. Yep. Yeah, my name is Adrian Butterworth. I am a lecturer in journalism here at Bournemouth University, and doing a doctoral project on asking the question, to what extent is the university television studio an inclusive learning space?
Great. And Phil? Phil, can you hear us?
Phil Matthews, me?
Yes, that's you.
Hi there, sorry. Yeah, I'm a principal academic in screenwriting in the media production department.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for giving your time to me this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I take a human rights lens to TV production, and then I'm going to go into a number of case studies based on the research that I've done. Do put your hand up to ask a question at any point. I can see you all, so there's no problem with that. If there's something you particularly want to ask, but I'll also leave time at the end for further questions. So with that, I will crack on. So why do I use the human rights lens? Well, I find it a very useful framework in terms of looking at social issues and actually environmental issues, as well as a human right to a clean and healthy environment. They are a set of international standards. So I work with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with the international covenants that support them, with the International Labour Organisation's fundamental principles and rights at work, and with other UN conventions. And then most importantly, and I'll explain this in a bit more detail, I work with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And that's the reason that the broadcasts I work with have been asking these questions. In terms of human rights, they're a whole set. They are universal, inherent, indivisible, inalienable. They can't be taken away from people. I see them as a set of minimum standards. And so being able to look at risks or harms to people and put it into language like the right to non-discrimination, the right to life. So taking what people do on diversity and inclusion or on safety practices and being able to reflect it back in terms of human rights language has been very useful, actually. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights came in 2011, and they set out 3 pillars. And what was unique and different about them was that the second pillar said that all companies of any size have a separate corporate responsibility to respect human rights, regardless of what the state does. And that was the first time, actually, that duties were put on companies in this way, rather than expecting human rights to be something that only the state does. So that happened in 2011, and since then we've started to see this idea turn more into hard law in different countries. And the other thing that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights said was that companies should undertake what they called human rights due diligence. And they use the phrase due diligence because it sounds quite businessy and corporate, but it does actually have quite a specific meaning that's a little bit different to how due diligence is otherwise used in the corporate world. And it has 4 components. It says that companies should make sure that they understand all their human rights and risks and impacts. So they should be assessing those. They should then take effective action to mitigate and prevent those risks and impacts. They should track and monitor how effective those actions are, and then they should communicate their progress. And all of that should be supported by a policy commitment and also by a means for people to raise grievances and access remedy directly from companies. And it should be informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. Every part of that should be informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. So understanding the risks should involve engagement, the tracking and monitoring, everything. So it's all about understanding who might be impacted, identifying the risks to those people. And then the other thing it said was that it wasn't just about what the company immediately did, but it's as a result of its operations, its supply chains, and its business relationships. Now, for the broadcasters looking at this who are putting out commitments about supporting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that meant understanding the supply chains of their main products, some of which are programs, and how those programs are made is what I have been looking at for the last 6 years now. Just in terms of legislative developments, just to give you an idea of where we're starting to see hard law come in. So in green, we have mandatory due diligence laws in various places, including the EU had the most advanced one. They're now arguing about how to water it down to virtually nothing, but that's beside the point. But it's quite interesting. We've also had the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, which doesn't involve mandatory due diligence, but does involve reporting. And it takes a sort of human rights framing actually in the way in the guidance document for it. But we're also now starting to see interesting developments in places like South Korea and Thailand, while also looking at mandatory human rights due diligence laws. The other thing is national action plans. So this is where the state is expected to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. And you can see there are various interesting parts of the world that have been developing national action plans or adopted them. And again, that's sort of driving some of the government priorities around this. So this is sort of where it's coming from. So one of our starting points was really to understand who in TV is impacted by the way it is made. And within the forum, we have identified 8 groups of people that we think are impacted by the way TV is made. So we have audiences who are either studio audiences or viewers, people who interact with the material. We have what I call talent. I really need to change that term because I know it's not currently in vogue, but the cast that appear on screen. We have crew, and that includes local crew in countries that are where filming is taking place. We have ancillary workers. These are all the people who are not often seen as part of crew, but without whom you can't make a TV production, who are on site, like cleaners, drivers, facilities, security. Post-production, we've pulled out as a separate group, and I'll explain a bit more. It's one of my case studies. We've done some human rights risks looking at post-production. Then you have workers in the supply chains for the goods that are used. So if you think about the vehicles that are used, equipment, clothing, all the art supplies, there will be workers in those supply chains. We have the communities who are local to filming, who might be impacted in some way. And then we have people who are not cast, but they are the subjects, the contributors or participants in TV shows. They may be in documentary or reality shows, for example, or on news or sports, all different things. So these are the groups that we think about. So I'm going to talk through now 4 case studies from the various pieces of research that we have done and published, and some of the insights that we're getting. And also I'm going to talk at the end, I'm going to give, I've got several examples, but how the broadcasters are taking this material and applying it in practice as well. So the first one I want to talk about is ancillary workers. And this is a group that we started out with. The very first question the broadcasters asked me was, is there a risk of modern slavery in the way TV is made in the UK? And I focused in on these ancillary workers because we know that within workforces generally, cleaners, drivers, security guards are high risk for modern slavery. And when I did this work originally, which was published in 2020, I didn't find systemic risks of modern slavery, but I did find a lot of labour practice problems. And this has become a theme for us. We still think we are one of probably the only TV organisation in the UK that actually pays attention to the ancillary workers. And I'm trying hard to get it into other industry bodies, but with some difficulty. Anyway, the examples we found then were catering workers, examples of sleeping on the kitchen floor between shifts, general lack of consideration for their working conditions. I was on a set where they'd had some drama overnight, some issue, and everything had been pushed back that day. And there was someone running around at 9:30 in the morning saying, we're just moving the schedule. Lunch will either be brought forward to 12 or pushed back to 2. We haven't decided yet. Now, if you are making lunch for 150 people, and you suddenly have to change it by an hour in one direction or another, that is a huge impact on you and your workforce. And it wasn't considered at all. Security, very often we were finding people who said that they felt unable to take a toilet break in a 12-hour shift or had no access to toilets at all. Cleaners, they're often doing things at night. When they are unobserved, they're quite invisible part of the workforce. The ones that we did manage to speak to talked about real problems with being paid on time, having sufficient shifts. They were all on 0 hours contracts. Rigger drivers, we've done a bit of a deep dive on these, lots of different issues, but one of the things that stood out was if you are laying, these are people who lay cables for things like sporting events or live broadcasts. And if you've laid cables for a football match and it happens in the evening, you then often have to de-rig in the dark because the venue will turn all the lights out. And you're pulling cables through the gutters and the dirtiest parts of a stadium. And it's actually a very hazardous thing to do. So quite significant safety issues there. We found that drivers and couriers were being asked to take illegal loads or asked to drive longer than allowed, and then being threatened with blacklisting if they refused. And we've also included, hotel workers, because hotels is part of production supply chains. They are often booking hotels. And we know that there are cases of modern slavery in the hospitality industry all over the world, and also a lot in terms of long shifts with no days off. So we've included that in there as part of the supply chain to be considering. Now, after doing this, one of the things that our members wanted was to understand how widespread is this? What are the issues? Can we do something more quantitative? And it's taken us quite a long time, but yesterday we published our first quantitative research on ancillary workers, which we did in partnership with the University of Nottingham. And so I'm going to take you through some of those findings as well. So this is building on this initial research we did. So we divided the findings into red, amber and green, and we had one red finding, which was an extremely significant issue that we think needs urgent attention. And what we found was that exhausted drivers are on set carrying passengers in unlicensed, poorly maintained and uninsured vehicles. So of the drivers that answered our survey, only 28% said they were always able to take breaks. 88% reported usual shift lengths of more than 11 hours. 96% said they'd worked shifts of 15 hours or more in the last 12 months. 52% said they'd sometimes or always felt pressure to accept unsafe working conditions. Lots of them gave us examples of working really long hours, not being able to take breaks, not being able to pause to eat at all. And with driving, they're carrying around cast and crew. There are significant safety issues for everybody if your drivers are exhausted. We also heard reports of a lot of cash in hand work and effectively illegal employment, people not having right to work checks, the wrong licenses being used, poorly maintained vehicles, not the right insurances or up-to-date MOTs. And the way that this was happening were reports of things like backhanders to transport captains. So the people in charge of bringing in a driving company taking a cut in some way. We also heard of some transport captains who would bill the production for the driving service, but then skim off an amount and pay the driving service much less. So the production thought that they were paying more for the driving service, and actually it was going to transport captains in the middle. How extensive the transport captain problem is, I've got no idea at this stage, but we heard of said more than one example, let's say, of dodgy issues happening. So this feels like something that's really important that productions look into immediately, that there are a lot of problematic practices going on with drivers. And I was on my way to an event to report some of these findings, and my taxi driver told me he'd also worked for all the major broadcasters as a driver, and he confirmed all the findings that I had, which was quite an interesting conversation. As well as the red finding, we had 8 amber findings. Oh dear, I didn't think I'd put this in here like this. Sorry, we have got to build everything. So the first one was a lack of basic amenities. 53% said that they didn't always have access to a toilet and a place to wash hands. This is across all the survey respondents. And it wasn't a huge number of people who responded to the survey, but we did a bit of a deep dive into some of these areas. So I'm quite confident in these. 48% said that access to drinking water wasn't always available. 73% didn't always have a place to spend breaks, and 61% said they didn't always have somewhere secure to store belongings. These are quite basic things to have in a workplace, I think: access to a toilet, somewhere to wash your hands, and so forth. Lots of issues in terms of problems with payment. Fewer than half said that they were always paid the full amount that had been agreed in advance. And there were a number that also said they were never paid the full amount, and 19% said they were never paid the full amount. Not enough workers for the job needed. So things like if you don't have enough drivers, they can't take the breaks and they're exhausted. Not enough cleaners means that they cannot keep a standard of hygiene for everybody. Not enough security means actually the place may not be safe. And again, people felt unable to take breaks because they couldn't cover their position. Really long shifts and lack of rest days as well. I know that's an issue across the industry, but these are sort of some of the lowest paid and most precarious of workers. 66% said their usual shift length was 11 to 14 hours. And 9% said their usual shift length was more than 14 hours. 13% said the longest shift length in the last 12 months was more than 18 hours. Trying to do this sort of work over those sort of hours, I think there are a lot of issues and risks that come with it. And when travel time is included, 48% had shifts that were more than 18 hours. 36% had worked more than 7 days in a row without a 24-hour break, and 16% had worked more than 14 days in a row without a 24-hour break in the last year. One of the other things that we found was that a lot of these workers are self-employed. And of those that are self-employed, we found that they tend to work longer hours for less money and take on more personal risk. So of the self-employed workers, 69% reported being paid below £15 per hour, which is a gross rate, which actually brings them below if they were on a payroll and being paid the minimum wage. It brings them below if they're paying their right taxes, national insurance, and so on, and without any protections. 87% said their usual shift lengths, the self-employed ones, were more than 11 hours. We also had five individuals reported being paid below £11 an hour, and 16 who reported usual shift lengths of more than 13 hours. It is a real issue, actually, these precarious workers. And I think, we haven't put this in the report, but that in most cases they should not be self-employed. They should have worker status. Workers also reported feeling often undervalued and poorly treated. There was a failure to address issues raised. This was interesting. So amongst productions generally, we find that crew working in productions are often afraid to flag problems, whether it's safety problems or cultural problems, bullying and harassment. They are afraid to raise things because of a fear of blacklisting. It's not the same, interestingly, with some of these ancillary workers, many of whom are really knowledgeable about health and safety law. They will flag things and then it disappears. It doesn't go into production reports, it doesn't go into incident reports, it doesn't go higher. So people don't know about the issues that they are very conscious of and have reported. And finally, we also found some additional safety risks. So we found it's very, very rare to DBS check any drivers or security, even though they may be working very closely with children. Drivers reported having pressure from passengers to drive extra fast, to stop in places that they shouldn't, and they felt that they would be threatened with losing their job if they didn't comply. And there were also quite a few stories about people having to work at remote locations overnight, actually particularly security and drivers, and having to fear of robbery, for example. But within the report, we also, there we go, you're not included, this is the workers feeling undervalued. You're not included as part of the overall team, you get left out. People just want you to get on with it. I think one of the cleaners was saying that the cleaners are expected to clean all the tables in the catering area, but aren't allowed to eat any of the food there, which feels very unfair. There were some good things though. We had a number of green findings. So people saying actually there's some really positive things, and this demonstrates that the good stuff can happen. So we found great examples of really fair working conditions, like releasing workers early and when they weren't needed, but not reducing their pay as a result, and examples of specifying minimum expectations, like security guards should always have access to a toilet, should be offered hot food if the rest of the crew is getting it, and so on, and that actually making a huge difference to people. There's some examples here that I thought were quite nice as well. A cleaner being added to the production credits, a security guard who regularly worked on horse racing, the presenter who knew him because he was sort of part of the horse racing family as a result, wished him well for his illness on a live feed, a unit driver who became really ill. And if you are self-employed, which the unit drivers usually are, you have no safety net. The production collected quite a lot of money for him to support his recovery. A cleaner who was cast as a supporting actor for the day, and as I mentioned, the minimum expectations that have been set for security, which is an initiative that Sky Sports has done, and they have raised standards for security. So that report is public. It's on our website. It's called Every Role Matters. So that's a big area of our work, is around the ancillary workforce. A slightly different, I don't know why I should have checked this before, apologies, way that this wasn't research as such, but it felt like a gap, was in terms of location due diligence. When you're checking locations, how do you bring in a human rights lens? And so we reviewed some existing location documents with a human rights lens, and then we held one of our regular forum meetings to discuss this in more detail. And we came up with 4 areas to add in human rights questions. So the contextual risk, what is it about the area that you're going to, the country that you're filming in, that you might need to consider. So, for example, conflict risk of some sort and how you might intersect with that. What the legal frameworks are, standards of health and safety, employment conditions, and so on. Whether the country discriminates against particular groups, things like natural hazards as well. So lots of things to do with contextual risk. Then there's things that are specific to the actual location that you're going to be filming in, whether that's a hospital or a particular village or wherever it might be. And then it's about understanding the relationship of those people with the security providers that you might be using if you're depending on public security, for example. Understanding local habitats and ecosystems and what impact you might have, and thinking about the location safety, its accessibility, how remote it is. Lots of these things will already be thought about, but one of the things that we are trying to do is get people to think about everyone who might be impacted. Then it's about the actual activity. What are you doing? Are you putting drones up in the air? Are you bringing in 500 extras? That kind of thing. So thinking about the impact of large vehicles, large-scale construction, what resources, you need loads of water, for example. And then afterwards, the sort of subsequent things, the knock-on impacts. So how are you portraying a place? What's its reputation? And one of the things we identified was, what gets overlooked in terms of locations. So extreme weather, you might think, right, we need to, we know that this location it's at risk of high heat. So you might have lots of mitigations in place for the crew, but perhaps the security guards that guard the perimeter get overlooked. Maybe you're filming in a hot, dry area, and you might do a lot of work to make sure the production is well supplied with water, but perhaps you're diverting it from a local community, and that hasn't been considered. That's the sort of the wider piece. Who's not getting that water that would otherwise have it? If you are filming in a remote location away from grid electricity, you might plan to use generators, but that puts additional stress on the people responsible for maintaining those generators. How have you considered their well-being and mental health, given they have to support an entire production, and sometimes that may not be factored in. And then it's also the ultimate consequences of transmission and its impact on that community. Is it going to lead to a huge influx of people who want to take a picture in a particularly beautiful area? Is it going to, there might be all sorts of consequences. So these are the sorts of things, and we ended up putting together a white paper with a checklist or examples of questions that could be asked. And also we produced a number of country 2 pages which look at contextual human rights issues. So this country, so the example I've got there is Hungary, you can't really see it, but one of the examples there might be, well, Hungary, it discriminates against LGBTQ individuals. So you might need to think how that would impact the crew, particularly international crew that are traveling, how you forge inclusion and belonging within a team, given the context that you are working in. So those are the sorts of resources that we then pull together on the basis of these discussions. The third case study I want to talk about is security. So security is often just seen as a mitigation of other risks, but actually we did a whole piece of work to demonstrate all the risks in terms of security practices themselves. And we did that for documentary, news and sport. And we took lessons from the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, which have had lots of issues, and also from international development. And what we found is that there are significant gaps in due diligence done on security providers. So a production, they say, right, we need some security. Maybe they outsource that to a local fixer, or they just bring in anyone, they stick some bodies on the ground, and then their insurance risk is covered. But actually, the type of security you use can bring in risks of its own. So there was an example in Denver where there was a news crew that went to cover a protest, and they took along a security guard, and he ended up shooting somebody dead. And it turned out they hadn't done any checks on their security provider. The security provider had subcontracted it and hadn't done any checks for their subcontractor. The subcontractor had subcontracted it further to this gentleman who was not licensed to operate as a security guard in Denver and shouldn't have had a weapon on him. Nobody knew he was armed. And it's still being litigated through the courts about 4 years on. So that's one example. But as well as private security, public security is a risk. So the example I have here is the UEFA Champions League final in Paris, where the police tear gassed a lot of fans, and it was by, I think, sheer luck that nobody was killed. And the behaviour of the public security and the police didn't appear on any of the broadcaster risk assessments, even though they posed a significant risk to fans, to crew who were impacted. And it wasn't the first time the police have done this in France at a football game. So it just sort of hadn't been thought about. It was just passed off as, okay, security is covered, not thinking about the human rights impacts that security, who have a certain, they can escalate or de-escalate violence. They have a role in conflict, how that might impact. And off the back of the research we did, we then ran a dialogue project on inclusive security practices as well, because one of the things we found was that a lot of the teams within broadcasters who advise on security are ex-military, ex-law enforcement, and are themselves not particularly diverse. And they were having to advise very diverse teams traveling to all sorts of different places, and they weren't very confident in terms of how to do this effectively. And on the other side, we talked to production teams who felt they weren't particularly well supported if they were a woman traveling as the only woman in the team to Saudi Arabia, or if they're a particular ethnicity going to film a drama in a place where that was going to draw attention to themselves. So we ran a dialogue process, a very different form of research again, in terms of how security and production teams can have better conversations. And it was the first of its kind that's happened like this. And we had some resources that came out at the end of this. We didn't have a research report, but it's stimulated more conversations within the broadcasters. And we identified a whole load of reasons this happens and then how to do it better as well. One thing I forgot to say about the Ancillary Workers project we've just published, which is actually really important from a research point of view, is that was the first one we've worked with peer researchers. We had a cleaner, a driver, and a security guard who are part of the core research team, who helped design the survey, disseminate the survey, analyse it, review the report, and then in the industry event that we did to discuss the recommendations, they were also there leading some of the discussion, and that's been really valuable in terms of bringing in that stakeholder engagement piece. And I think the way that, well, I know certainly that some of the broadcasters see this work as part of the way that they fund meaningful stakeholder engagement to understand human rights risks and what they should be doing about it as well. So it's very much part of that. The fourth case study I wanted to flag was post-production, which is something that we published in January, which took a human rights lens to the world of post-production. And actually, of all the areas I've worked in oil and gas and mining and the food industry and construction. I think this was the piece of research I've done that in some ways I found the most shocking because of the extent of normalized terrible practice within post-production. So I found a lot of examples of things, what I would call illegal, barely legal practices, lack of contracts, below minimum wage work, inappropriate payment terms, non-compliance with health and safety, failure to make reasonable adjustments, just like really bad practice. And because it's a sector riddled with insecurity, people ended up accepting really bad jobs. They had a lot of stress from trying to find those jobs. There's a complete lack of formal recruitment processes, formal employment practices, formal training, formal career paths. Then there are lots of disparities in the way people are brought into post-production. So some are contracted directly by a production, some by a facility, some by other freelancers, often with nothing written down. And then it's also really unclear where the duty of care lies if something happens, and who has responsibility. And ultimately, nobody takes responsibility. Also, a lot of bullying and blame culture, blame frequently pushed down because there's insecurity across the industry. and often it's the junior roles that end up having the blame pushed to them. Really problematic and abusive labour practices, so excessively long working hours, lack of rest days, high pressure to deliver, insufficient breaks, and so on. But also things like a lack of daylight, because they're working in small soundproofed rooms, especially in winter, airless rooms sometimes as well, and an expectation to always remain available when projects are postponed. And then the fact that they may have to work by themselves for long hours repeatedly on traumatic content. This is something that's been rising up the agenda, I think, within production and crew working on things like true crime, but actually thinking about those in post who are going over and over the same thing for 12 hours without a break. You know, the police have to do this as part of their job, but they don't do it for 12 hours on their own without a break. They have very strict protocols around how long you can look at traumatic things for, and mental health support, and that doesn't happen in post. Then the thing that really hit me was the impacts on health, safety and family lives. So people said they couldn't make healthcare appointments because of the way things were done. They experienced a lot of repetitive injuries. There's a quote in the report about an engineer who got such bad RSI, he was doing everything with his feet. They have no opportunities for healthy eating. They're driving home when exhausted after long shifts. They're unable to establish and maintain relationships with family and friends, and a significant number told me that they felt working in post-production was incompatible with having a family of their own, which I just found horrific. This is not how the creative industry should be. And also feeling unable to raise concerns. And one of the things that's quite important about this was that we wanted to identify the fact that there are some aspects of this. A lot of people said, well, it's like this across the whole industry. There are some things that are particular to post-production, which means the responses have to be particular as well. So the work tends to be done by individuals or very small teams. So you don't have those opportunities for camaraderie, but for seeing what good practice should look like, and so forth. It happens at the end of the production process, and they often have to make do with whatever budget or time is left over. So they are the ones most squeezed in that side of things. We are seeing, because of drops in commissioning, a lot of post-production facilities knowingly underbidding. So they start from a position of, this can't be done for this budget, but we're going to try and do it anyway. The way, post-production facilities that underbid, they're either not making any profit and they're losing money, or they're using very junior people and not able to deliver the quality, or they're exploiting people and asking them to effectively work for free. And I found very widespread examples of that. And this issue of unclear accountabilities for addressing the issues as well. So the report then sets out the ways that the actions of broadcasters and production commissioners and production companies impact this. And going back to the beginning and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, they also say that if you cause or contribute to human rights harms in your supply chain, then you have a responsibility to remedy. And what I hope this report shows is that the way that some commissioners and some production companies operate, they are very much contributing to human rights harms further down the supply chain and into post-production. So they have a responsibility to take action and remedy. And it was particularly demand for work that's cheap, fast and high quality, poor communication, delays, last minute changes, and a failure to recognise good practice by post-production facilities and reward it, and instead just going with the cheapest. So those are the 4 case studies. Just very quickly, industry factors that increase the risks, the way that many freelancers, the subcontracting practices that happen, the fact there are skill shortages at different points, cost and time pressures of the industry, the long working hours, a leadership culture that maybe valorizes the people who work all night, or and sort of pushes the blame piece down, the very precarious nature of the work, and then also production increasingly moving to countries with contextual human rights challenges. So drama being made in places like Hungary and Poland, entertainment in South Africa, sport in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But lots of opportunities to find levers for change. So I've got here things like commissioning practices, training opportunities, what information can you provide? Often it's, suppliers don't even think about this, so they don't know. There are things like production portals, pre-approved supplier lists. You can get the human rights piece into all of these areas and figure out how to align things. And just last slide, just to give you an example of some practical application in terms of learning from this and then applying it. I worked with ITV Sport in the lead up to the Men's World Cup in Qatar. And on the back of the ancillary workers research, we developed some due diligence questions, and we did due diligence on the driving company to understand what all their practices were, and on the 3 hotels that were being used for the presenters and for the crew, which was quite difficult. But we worked quite a lot to get information back and forth. We also took external advice from other human rights experts, and then thought about, well, how do we support the team to make sure that, we've done the due diligence in advance. How do we support the team when they go in? So they had a briefing from a human rights expert and got really engaged on this in advance. And we brought in someone who had spent plenty of time in Qatar, could answer lots of questions. Then we developed a response plan. So if someone were to find an exploited hotel worker, what do they need to do? What's ITV's responsibility? Where can they report things? Which channels can they use? How do they triage different scenarios? And then during the tournament, the crew end up talking directly to hotel workers, security guards, cleaners, having been briefed on the types of conversation to have. They didn't identify any concerns actually while they were there in practice. I think partly because Qatar did a bit of a sweeping, but they did recognise that there were things that could come up later. And so in terms of remedy, they decided to make a donation to a local charity that was working with the migrant workers and supporting them. So they provided a donation to support exploited migrant workers after the tournament had finished. And they said, and I can see it in them, it really helped to build capacity within ITV to identify things like modern slavery risks and how to put the right mitigations in place. And it highlighted some of the challenges around doing this for a major sporting event. And it's one of the scenarios that has now been, it helped to inform a new document that's currently out for consultation with the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, that is a broadcasting framework, what to do in particular scenarios, how you look at it editorially, but also in terms of the operations piece and how you support